Hi everyone, thanks for joining me again for this month's AAIB Bulletin Roundup. Bulletin is packed this month with a single field investigation but 11 correspondence investigations. Today we'll talk about several light aircraft accidents and then talk in detail about a TUI 737 where the pilots neglected to pressurise the aircraft in the climb. I've added some timestamps below, so if you want to jump to that one in particular, then go right ahead. The first accident we're going to discuss started at Prestwick Airport near Glasgow in April this year. The pilot, who was fully licensed with 307 hours of experience, was taking a refresher flight with an instructor because he was out of the currency requirements for his flying club. They were flying a Piper PA-28 Archer, a popular light aircraft used for PPL training and common in flying clubs all over the world. Now, most flying clubs have some sort of requirement that you fly fairly regularly, or you'll need to have a refresher flight with an instructor before you hire a club aircraft. This club in particular had a requirement to fly every 62 days. The club's chief instructor had no valid medical, so he wasn't fit to fly as pilot in command, but nevertheless the pair had planned some general handling exercises including stalling and practice forced landings before returning to the airport for several circuits. This is all pretty standard for a refresher flight. The stalling and practice forced landings went without incident and the aircraft contacted Prestwick Airport and rejoined the circuit. It landed and stopped on the runway for 90 seconds for traffic spacing and then took off again. An EasyJet A320 was in the left-hand circuit for base training, and this necessitated the air traffic controller to request the accident aircraft to orbit for spacing. This is a common request to light aircraft at Prestwick Airport and is clearly seen in the flight path detailed in the report. After 3 orbits, the aircraft was seen rolling out onto a right base leg for the runway, after being cleared by the controller. After giving the clearance, the controller turned to look for the A320 and then turned back around, but he couldn't see the Archer. The pilot and instructor reported that as the aircraft rolled out onto the base leg, the engine ran down and eventually stopped. The instructor took control and attempted a glide approach to runway 21. However, it quickly became clear that the runway was out of gliding range. A brief troubleshooting took place and the instructor asked the pilot to change the fuel tank, presumably to eliminate an empty tank as the cause for the engine failure, while simultaneously looking outside for a suitable landing site. Understandably, there was no mayday call made as the instructor was fully focused on this time for real, forced landing. He picked a field to the left but had to raise the nose to clear some trees. At that point he felt some buffet, which is an impending sign of a stall, and likely here caused due to the increased angle of attack as he tried to avoid the trees. The aircraft did strike the trees, which brought it to an abrupt halt and then hit the ground vertically nose down. Air traffic control tried to raise the aircraft on the radio, but the calls went unanswered and nobody in the tower was able to make any visual contact. It was actually the emergency services that subsequently informed the tower of the crash, but at the same time the A320 that was doing circuits reported that it had sighted the aircraft on the ground. There's a Coast Guard helicopter based at Prestwick Airport and that attended the scene and flew both pilots to hospital in Glasgow. So, what went wrong? The weather conditions at the time were such that there was a serious risk of carburetor icing. Carb icing is a situation where water vapour freezes on the internal surfaces of the carburetor, which reduces airflow into the engine. Without air, fuel cannot combust and the engine will run rough and eventually fail. You might think that it has to be really cold to develop ice in an engine. After all, it is burning fuel. But as fuel is added to the air mixture in the carburetor, energy in the form of heat is lost due to the vaporization of the fuel, so icing can actually form when the outside temperature is even as high as 25 degrees Celsius. Humidity is much more of a factor, and as anyone in the UK can tell you, it's usually pretty wet. Nevertheless, the risk is higher at temperatures between 0 and 10 degrees Celsius. On the day of the accident, the temperature was 11 and the dew point was 5, and as you can see from this chart included in the accident report, the risk of icing would be extremely high. I also fly a PA-28 and we select the carburetor heater on for any engine power setting below 2000 RPM. Neither pilot could be sure if they selected the carb heater on when in the final downwind leg, and when the AAIB examined the engine, they found that the carburetor heat valve was actually closed, meaning that it must have been selected to off when the aircraft crashed. Carburetor icing is common and can be dangerous, as we've seen from this accident. The CAA has published a safety sense leaflet giving further details about the dangers of this phenomenon and sensible precautions to take to prevent it. All light aircraft pilots should be familiar with the dangers of carburetor icing and what they need to do to prevent accidents such as this. Now briefly we'll touch on a few other little mishaps from general aviation reported in Bulletin this month. Firstly, in August this year, a Boeing A75 Stearman landed at Lundy Island airstrip in North Devon. Lundy is a tiny island home to about 20 people, so as you might expect, its airstrip isn't that advanced. It consists of a field with painted white stones used to mark out the runway, which are barely visible on satellite imagery. Unfortunately, the accident aircraft struck one of these stones on landing, causing the left main gear to collapse and the left wing to impact the ground. The aircraft is a tail dragger, so when you're on the ground, forward visibility is extremely limited, which no doubt contributed to the incident. Now, with Lundy being so small and the facilities being so poor, I'd really like to know how they managed to get this aircraft back in the air. Next, a Jodell DR11 aircraft with its 77-year-old pilot was flying circuits at Rhigos airfield in Wales, and the pilot selected the carb heat on to approach. He'd obviously read the CAA safety sense leaflet. Now, as he did that, the engine stopped and he'd accidentally cut the fuel instead of selecting the carb heater on. He quickly attempted to restart the engine, but it turned over a few times and then cut out again. The aircraft struck a bank on the airfield boundary and the pilot suffered serious facial and spinal injuries. And thirdly, another Spitfire, the second time in as many months this aircraft type has appeared in Bulletin, this time because the canopy detached during climb shortly after takeoff. Similar to last month's accident, the pilot felt distracted during pre-flight preparation and the side door was not closed properly. If the side door of a Spitfire isn't closed, the canopy can't latch, and this was the cause of it eventually becoming detached in the climb. The aircraft then landed without further incident. I'd now like to spend some time talking about a commercial incident where some of the pilot's actions are a little bit questionable. The TUI Boeing 737-800 was on a holiday flight between Manchester and the Greek island of Kos. On a previous flight, the aircraft's air conditioning system had not operated correctly and maintenance were asked to investigate the issue. That took place overnight and everything was considered to be sorted and working fine. Neither pilot was actually expecting to be on the flight. They were both on standby and allocated in the middle of the night. In fact, the captain was woken by his phone going off in the middle of the night and had only 3 hours sleep before he managed to get to the aircraft. The co-pilot was late arriving to the airport due to the closure of a motorway, and he met the rest of the crew at the aircraft. The crew reported to the AAIB that they didn't feel rushed, but they were certainly aware of the time pressure given the late arrival of the co-pilot. Taxi and departure from runway 5 left at Manchester was uneventful, and the left seat pilot was manually flying the aeroplane. After takeoff, the checks were completed, and these include a check that the bleed air switches are selected to on. Bleed air is compressed air that's taken from turbine engines before the fuel injection stage, and it's used, for example, to provide pressure to the aircraft's cabin and can also be used to start the remaining engine. Depending on the weather, the aircraft weight and the runway length, bleed air might not be turned on until after takeoff, as there is a slight reduction in engine performance when it's selected. Both pilots recalled that the bleed air was selected to on during this checklist. Passing through 15,000 feet, the cabin altitude alert sounded and it was noticed that both of these switches were off. The aircraft was levelled off and both switches selected to on. However, shortly after that, the right air conditioning pack failed. The packs are the refrigeration units carried in aircraft responsible for providing compressed air at a selected temperature to the aircraft and thus responsible for its overall pressurization. The Boeing 737 has 2 air conditioning packs, a left pack and a right pack. Neither pilot performed the cabin altitude warning checklist, which includes the donning of oxygen masks. The reason this is so important is that if the aircraft is unpressurized, then the people on it can suffer from hypoxia, a medical term for lack of oxygen in the body. This has dangerous implications which start off with confusion, disorientation, and culminate in a loss of consciousness. The famous aircraft depressurization event occurred in 2005 when Helios Flight 522 flew into terrain, killing all 121 people on board. Though we'll never know what actually happened, the leading theory is that the aircraft was never pressurised and everyone on board lost consciousness. Such is the insidious nature of gradual hypoxia, it's unlikely the crew noticed anything was wrong before it was far too late. Now, below 14,000 feet, the risk of hypoxia in fit and well people is low, but it certainly can be sufficient to affect cognitive performance and decision making. The pilots on this TUI flight were satisfied that the aircraft was pressurised appropriately, as the dial in the cockpit showed the cabin altitude was 2,000 feet. The crew decided to continue the flight and requested a further climb from air traffic control. However, reaching 20,000 feet, a pack fault caution appeared. Despite running through the checklist, the fault was not recoverable, and after discussing this with the TUI's maintenance team, the crew elected to return to Manchester. They had to hold for 50 minutes to burn off fuel and decrease the aircraft weight, but then it carried out an uneventful landing. Now, this incident has left me feeling a little alarmed. A rushed and overtired crew omitted a crucial item from an after-takeoff checklist, and when the aircraft alerted them to a problem, they omitted a crucial part of the emergency response which could have had potentially devastating consequences. Surely this isn't acceptable for commercial aviation in the UK in 2024. I hope you enjoyed this bulletin roundup for November. Remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and come back next month for some more great aviation content. Bye bye.